You put that device in your own son's throat, didn't you, Dr. Ashford? The question exploded through the hospital corridor like a gunshot, freezing everyone mid-motion. But to understand how we got to this moment, how an ex-convict janitor came to accuse one of America's most respected surgeons of unspeakable evil, we need to go back 30 minutes to when everything started to unravel. Get your hands off my son, screamed Victoria Ashford, her Cartier bracelet glinting under the fluorescent lights of the hospital emergency room as she tried to pull Marcus away from her 7-year-old boy. Marcus didn't move. His calloused hands, marked by years of prison labor, remained steady on the child's shoulders. If I don't do this right now, your son will be dead in less than 2 minutes. The boy's lips were turning blue. His tiny body convulsed on the hospital bed while 3 nurses stood frozen, waiting for the doctor who was still 5 minutes away. 5 minutes that little Daniel Ashford didn't have. Marcus had been mopping the floor in that same hallway when he heard the commotion. 6 months out of Riverside State Penitentiary, where he'd served 8 years for a crime he didn't commit. And here he was, wearing a janitor's uniform in the country's most exclusive private hospital. The same hospital where people like the Ashfords came when they wanted to avoid mixing with common folk. Security. Victoria's voice echoed through the corridor, her perfectly styled blonde hair disheveled for the first time in years. Someone call security. This criminal is attacking my child. But Marcus had already seen what the nurses couldn't. The way Daniel clutched his throat, the specific shade of purple spreading across his face, the silent scream in his eyes that Marcus recognized from another life, another time when he was someone completely different. Your son isn't mute, Mrs. Ashford, Marcus said, his voice eerily calm as he positioned himself behind the boy. And he's not having a seizure. Something is lodged in his throat, cutting off his airway completely. Victoria froze. Daniel had been born mute, or so every specialist in the country had told her. Dozens of tests. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every expert agreed her son would never speak. You have no idea what you're talking about, she hissed, though her voice wavered. My son has been examined by the best doctors in... She didn't finish. Marcus had already made his move. His hand shot forward with surgical precision, fingers disappearing into Daniel's mouth as gasps erupted around the room. Victoria lunged forward, but a nurse grabbed her arm. Let him work, the nurse whispered, her eyes wide with recognition of what Marcus was doing. The next 15 seconds felt like 15 hours. Marcus's face was a mask of concentration, his fingers probing carefully, deliberately. Then, with a swift motion that made everyone flinch, he pulled. The object that emerged from Daniel's throat was small, metallic, and covered in blood and saliva. But what made Victoria's knees buckle wasn't the object itself. Fit was the sound that followed. A gasp, a cough, and then, for the first time in 7 years, Daniel Ashford spoke. Mama ... Double quotes, the word hung in the air like a miracle no one could explain. Nurses stood paralyzed. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. And Marcus simply stepped back, dropping the bloodied object into a medical tray, his expression unreadable. What ... What is that? Whispered one of the nurses, staring at the metallic piece. Marcus studied it for a long moment, his jaw tightening. That, he said slowly, is a piece of a medical implant. Specifically, part of a laryngeal suppressor. The words meant nothing to most people in the room. But to Marcus, they meant everything. Because he'd seen devices like this before, in a place he'd spent years trying to forget. Victoria's legs gave out. She collapsed into a chair, her designer dress crumpling around her. That's impossible. Daniel was born mute. Every doctor said every doctor was wrong, Marcus interrupted, his voice harder now. Or maybe they weren't looking for the right thing. He picked up the metallic fragment with a tissue, holding it up to the light. His hands weren't shaking, but something in his eyes suggested a storm brewing beneath the surface. Mrs. Ashford, when exactly did Daniel stop making sounds? Babies cry when they're born. Did your son cry? Victoria's face went pale. I don't remember. I was sedated. The birth was complicated. When I woke up, they told me he was healthy, but ... silent. My husband said it was a rare condition. He found the best specialists. He... ... She stopped, something clicking in her mind that she didn't want to acknowledge. Where's your husband right now? Marcus asked. The question landed like a bomb. Victoria's eyes widened, her breathing becoming shallow. He's traveling, business in Singapore. He's always traveling when... A phone buzzed. One of the nurses checked the hospital system and her face went white. Dr. Ashford just entered the building. He's on his way up. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the stance of someone preparing for a fight. Dr. Ashford? He repeated quietly. Your husband is a doctor? Victoria nodded slowly, something breaking in her eyes. He's the head of neurology here, one of the most respected surgeons in the country. The pieces were falling into place in Marcus's mind, forming a picture so horrific he almost couldn't believe it. Almost, but he'd seen too. much evil in his life to dismiss anything as impossible. Daniel, still catching his breath, looked up at Marcus with eyes that seemed far older than 7 years. The boy opened his mouth, testing his newfound voice, and whispered something that made Marcus's blood run cold. He said I was special. He said it was for science. The elevator doors at the end of the hall dinged open. If this story is grabbing your attention, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens when Dr. Ashford walks through those doors will change everything. You think you know about this family? Marcus turned toward the sound, his muscles tensing. After 8 years of surviving in prison, he'd developed instincts that never lied, and right now every instinct was screaming that the real danger was just about to arrive. Dr. Richard Ashford stepped out of the elevator with the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than Marcus earned in 6 months. He had the kind of face that appeared on magazine covers, distinguished, trustworthy, the very image of medical excellence. But Marcus noticed something else. The split-second hesitation when Ashford's eyes landed on his son, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when he saw the metallic fragment in the medical tray, and most telling of all, the complete absence of surprise on his face when he heard his son's voice. "Victoria, what's going on here?" Ashford's tone was measured, concerned, perfect. He moved toward his wife, but his eyes kept darting to Marcus. "I received an alert that Daniel was in the ER. Richard," he spoke. Victoria's voice cracked, tears streaming freely now. "Our son spoke. After 7 years, this man pulled something out of his throat and let me see my son." Ashford cut her off smoothly, already moving toward Daniel. But Marcus stepped into his path. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, doctor." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Ashford's expression shifted just for a moment into something cold and calculating before the mask of concern slid back into place. "Excuse me, who are you?" Ashford's eyes scanned Marcus's janitor uniform with barely concealed disdain. "Security. Why is maintenance staff interfering with a medical emergency?" "Marcus Chen," Marcus said quietly, holding his ground. "And I'm not interfering. I'm the reason your son is still breathing." The name hung in the air. Ashford's face went carefully blank, but Marcus saw it. The flicker of recognition quickly suppressed. "Chun," Ashford repeated the name slowly as if testing it. "That's interesting. We had a researcher by that name years ago. Dr. Marcus Chen, brilliant neurosurgeon actually, but he went to prison for medical malpractice resulting in death. Destroyed several patients' lives with experimental procedures that were never approved." Victoria gasped, instinctively pulling Daniel closer to her. The nurses exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly seeing Marcus in a different light. Marcus's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "I was framed. And you know exactly who framed me, don't you, Dr. Ashford? Is that some kind of accusation?" Ashford's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "Because it sounds like a convicted felon is harassing my family during a medical crisis." "Daddy?" Daniel's small voice cut through the tension. Everyone froze. It was only the second word they'd heard him speak, and the fear in it was unmistakable. Ashford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay, son. Daddy's here now. Everything will be fine." But Daniel pressed himself against his mother, his newly freed voice trembling. "It hurts when he checks my throat. It always hurts." The words were innocent enough, but Marcus saw Victoria's face change, saw the pieces starting to connect in her mind. All those routine checkups Ashford insisted on doing personally, the way he always sent her out of the room, how Daniel would be quiet and withdrawn for days afterward. "Mrs. Ashford," Marcus said carefully, "when was the last time your husband examined Daniel's throat?" 3 days ago." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He said it was important to monitor Daniel's condition regularly. He always said ... double quotes." She trailed off, her hand moving to her mouth as the horror of realization began to dawn. Ashford's composure cracked slightly. "Victoria, don't listen to this man. He's mentally unstable. He spent 8 years in prison. He's probably hoping to extort money from us, or the device in that tray," Marcus interrupted, pointing to the metallic fragment as a custom-made laryngeal suppressor. "I know because I helped design the prototype 9 years ago, before you stole my research and used it to frame me for malpractice." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. One of the nurses quietly picked up a phone, though Marcus couldn't tell if she was calling security or something else. Ashford laughed a cold, dismissive sound. "This is absurd. My son was born with a congenital condition. Everyone knows that. There are medical records, specialist reports, all signed by doctors you handpicked," Marcus countered. "All from this hospital where you're the head of neurology, where you have access to every record, every scan, every test result. These are serious accusations from a man with a criminal record," Ashford said, his voice taking on a harder edge. He turned to the nurses. "Call security. Now. And someone get me that device before it's contaminated further." But Marcus was faster. He grabbed the tray and held it out of reach. "This is evidence. And it stays exactly where it is until the police arrive." "Evidence of what?" Ashford's mask was slipping now, anger bleeding through. You're insane. I'm calling my lawyers. You'll be back in prison before nightfall for assault, harassment, and why would you do this? Victoria's voice cut through the escalating confrontation. She was staring at her husband with an expression that mixed disbelief with dawning understanding. Richard, why would you ... our son? He's our son. Ashford's face softened as he turned to his wife. Victoria's sweetheart, you're in shock. This man is manipulating you. Think about what you're saying. Why would I possibly... The research grant, Marcus spoke quietly, but every word landed like a hammer. The $50 million federal grant for developing communication devices for mute children. You needed test subjects. You needed long-term data. And you needed someone who couldn't report what you were doing to them. The room went silent. Victoria's face had gone white as paper. That grant made your career, Marcus continued, his voice harder now. It put you on the cover of Time magazine. Made you a hero. The surgeon who was helping voiceless children communicate. Except the children you were supposedly helping, including your own son, weren't actually mute, were they? Ashford's expression twisted into something ugly. You can't prove any of this. You're a convicted criminal with an axe to grind. No one will believe you. Maybe not. Marcus pulled out his phone with his free hand. But they might believe this. He turned the screen around. On it was a video, grainy but clear enough. It showed a much younger Ashford in a laboratory demonstrating a device to investors. And in the background, crying softly in a medical crib, was an infant with a familiar face. I installed security cameras in our old lab 9 years ago, Marcus said. Hidden ones. You never found them. This footage shows you testing the suppressor prototype on a 3-month-old baby. Your son, days after he was born. Victoria's scream pierced the air. She collapsed, but a nurse caught her. Daniel started crying, actual tears and sounds, his voice raw and unpracticed, but unmistakably real. Ashford lunged for the phone, but Marcus was ready. Years in prison had taught him to anticipate violence. He sidestepped smoothly, and 2 security guards who had just arrived grabbed Ashford's arms. "Let go of me," Ashford shouted, his carefully constructed image shattering completely. "Do you know who I am? I could end all your careers with one phone call." "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "the only career ending today is yours." Everyone turned. A woman in a sharp business suit stood there, FBI credentials held up for all to see. Behind her, 3 more agents filed into the room. "Dr. Richard Ashford," she said calmly, "you're under arrest for medical fraud, child abuse, and conspiracy to commit perjury. We've been investigating your research foundation for 6 months. Mr. Chen contacted us 3 weeks ago with evidence. This recording, combined with our findings, gives us enough for immediate arrest." Marcus had been planning this moment for months, ever since he'd gotten out of prison and started digging into the truth of what had happened to him. But watching Ashford's face crumble, watching the arrogant mask finally shatter completely, brought no satisfaction, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Ashford was shouting now, threatening lawsuits, claiming persecution, invoking his reputation. But his voice faded as the agents led him away in handcuffs. Victoria sat on the floor, holding Daniel, both of them crying. The boy's voice was rough, unpracticed, but he was forming words now, asking his mother why his throat didn't hurt anymore, why Daddy was angry, why the nice man with the mop had helped him. The FBI agent approached Marcus. "Mr. We'll need you to come down to the office to give a complete statement. Your testimony will be crucial for the prosecution." Marcus nodded, but his eyes were on Daniel. The boy who had lived 7 years in forced silence because his father valued fame and money over his own child's humanity. "Will there be more?" Marcus asked quietly. "More children he did this to?" The agent's expression darkened. "We're looking into 17 other cases connected to his research foundation. Children diagnosed as mute who were receiving experimental treatments from Dr. Ashford's team. 17. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. One of the nurses approached Marcus hesitantly. "Dr. Chen, is that really you? I heard stories about you when I started working here. They said you were brilliant but reckless. That you hurt people." Marcus gave her a tired smile. "They said a lot of things about me, most of them lies planted by a man who needed someone to take the fall for his illegal experiments. I lost my medical license, my career, 8 years of my life, but at least now maybe I can help fix some of the damage he caused." Victoria suddenly stood, still clutching Daniel. She walked over to Marcus, her face streaked with tears and mascara. For a moment he thought she might slap him for shattering her world, for exposing the truth she'd somehow managed not to see. Instead, she grabbed his hand with both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered brokenly. "Thank you for giving me back my son's voice." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. How do you respond to gratitude from a mother whose husband had tortured her child in the name of science? A woman who would now have to live with the knowledge that she'd been married to a monster. As the FBI agents finished securing the scene and taking preliminary statements, Marcus found himself alone in the hallway for a moment. Still wearing his janitor's uniform, still holding the mop he'd dropped earlier, 8 years in prison. A stolen career. A destroyed reputation, all because he'd discovered what Ashford was doing and threatened to expose him. But somehow, impossibly, he'd managed to stop it, to save at least one child, to finally prove the truth. The question now was, what came next? 3 weeks after Daniel Ashford spoke his first words in 7 years, Marcus sat in a cramped office at the FBI field headquarters, staring at a wall covered in photographs. 17 faces, 17 children, all diagnosed as mute, all treated by Dr. Richard Ashford's foundation. Agent Sarah Monroe placed a coffee cup in front of him. We've located 12 of them so far. The other 5 families moved out of state or out of the country. We're working on tracking them down. Marcus studied each face, memorizing them. How many had the devices implanted? All of them. Monroe's voice was tight with controlled anger. Ashford was more careful with the others. Used biodegradable materials that would dissolve over time, leaving minimal evidence. Daniel's device malfunctioned because Ashford used a newer prototype. It was supposed to be permanent. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Permanent. A child condemned to lifelong silence. So his father could collect research funding and accolades. The parents knew nothing? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Most were like Victoria Ashford, desperate, vulnerable, trusting a renowned specialist who promised hope. Ashford specifically targeted wealthy families who could afford his exclusive treatment program. He made them believe their children had rare congenital conditions that only he could manage. Marcus's phone buzzed. Another message from a lawyer, the third firm that week offering to represent him in a lawsuit against the state for wrongful imprisonment. Everyone wanted a piece of the story now. This con doctor exposes medical conspiracy was dominating news cycles across the country. He ignored it. Money wouldn't give him back 8 years. It wouldn't erase the things he'd endured in Riverside State Penitentiary. There's something else, Monroe said, sliding a folder across the desk. We found Ashford's personal files. He kept detailed records of everything, observations, developmental data, even video recordings of the children's progress. He documented his own crimes like they were legitimate medical research. Marcus opened the folder, and then immediately wished he hadn't. Page after page of clinical notes describing children's reactions to having their voices stolen. Ashford had observed them like lab rats, noting their frustration, their adaptation, their resignation. One entry made Marcus's stomach turn. Subject 7 Daniel shows remarkable resilience. After initial distress period, has adapted well to nonverbal communication. Mother remains convinced of congenital diagnosis. Excellent candidate for long-term study. He called his own son Subject 7, Marcus whispered. Monroe nodded grimly. The man is a sociopath. The psychiatric evaluation came back yesterday. No remorse whatsoever. He still insists he was conducting legitimate research that would have benefited humanity. Marcus closed the folder carefully, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. When's the trial? 6 months, probably. His legal team is already trying to delay, claiming they need time to prepare a defense. Meanwhile, he's out on bail, $5 million, which his family posted immediately. He's out? Marcus stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his coffee. You let him out? Judge's orders. Ashford has no prior criminal record, strong ties to the community, and his lawyers argued he's not a flight risk. Monroe's expression showed what she thought of that decision. He's under house arrest with an ankle monitor. But yes, he's home. Marcus began pacing the small office. 8 years in a concrete cell for a crime he didn't commit, while Ashford, who had tortured children, including his own son, got to wait for trial in his mansion. The families want to meet you, Monroe said, watching him carefully. The other families. They've been asking if you'd be willing to help evaluate their children. See if there's any lasting damage, maybe even testify about the original research. Marcus stopped pacing. I'm not a doctor anymore. The medical board revoked my license when I was convicted. We're working on that. Given that your conviction was based entirely on falsified evidence provided by Ashford, there's a strong case for reinstatement. It'll take time, but time. Marcus laughed bitterly. I've got plenty of that now. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a number he recognized, Victoria Ashford. He'd given her his contact information before leaving the hospital, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because she was as much a victim as anyone else. Maybe because Daniel would need someone who understood what had been done to him, he answered. Mrs. Ashford, Marcus. Her voice was steadier than it had been 3 weeks ago, but still fragile. I need your help. Daniel he's having nightmares. Terrible ones. He wakes up screaming, clutching his throat, saying he can't breathe. The therapist I hired doesn't understand what he went through. She keeps talking about trauma, but she doesn't really get it. Marcus closed his eyes. Of course Daniel was having nightmares. The boy had spent 7 years being gaslit by his own father, told his silence was natural, normal, unavoidable, and now he knew the truth, that his voice had been stolen deliberately by the person who was supposed to protect him most. What about his father? Marcus asked carefully. Has he tried to contact Daniel? A long pause. Richard's lawyers sent a letter requesting visitation rights. They're claiming that despite everything, he's still Daniel's father and has a legal right to see him. My lawyers are fighting it, but ... double quotes, her voice cracked. Marcus, I can't let that man near my son, not after what he did, but I don't know how to help Daniel heal. I don't know what to say to him. Marcus looked at Monroe, who was pretending not to listen but clearly hearing every word. Mrs. Ashford, I'm not a therapist. I'm not even officially a doctor anymore, but you understand. Victoria's desperation bled through the phone. You understand what Richard did because you were studying the same technology. You know how these devices work, what they do to a person. And you went through hell because you tried to stop him. Daniel knows that. He asks about you every day. The man who saved him. The weight of her words pressed down on Marcus like a physical thing. He hadn't saved anyone. He'd just stumbled into the right place at the right moment because he was mopping floors in a hospital hallway. But Daniel didn't see it that way. None of the families would see it that way. I'll think about it, Marcus said finally. I need to figure some things out first. After hanging up, he turned to Monroe. Tell me about Ashford's house arrest. What are the restrictions? Monroe pulled up a file on her computer. He's confined to his primary residence, a gated estate in Meadowbrook Hills, allowed out only for medical appointments and legal meetings with prior approval. Ankle monitor tracks his location 24/7. Any violation triggers immediate arrest. Who's monitoring him? Private security company contracted by the court. They do a physical check twice a day and the monitoring center tracks the ankle bracelet constantly. Monroe paused. Why are you asking? Marcus didn't answer directly. The files you found, Ashford's research documentation, where is it all now? Evidence lockup. Why? Because if he kept physical records, he might have kept other things too. Backup devices. Research materials. Maybe even lists of potential future subjects. Marcus's mind was racing now, connecting pieces. He's a narcissist who documented everything. He wouldn't have destroyed his life's work just because he got arrested. Monroe leaned forward, interested now. You think he has more evidence hidden somewhere? I think he has enough hidden at that house to put him away forever if we can find it. But his lawyers will fight any search warrant that isn't airtight. We need something concrete to justify it. So what are you suggesting? Marcus met her eyes. I'm suggesting that someone needs to get inside that house and find out what he's hiding. Someone he wouldn't expect. Someone who has a legitimate reason to be there. Understanding dawned on Monroe's face. You want to use yourself as bait. Make him think you're there to confront him. Maybe get him to confess or reveal where he's hidden evidence. Not exactly. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through recent messages. Victoria Ashford just invited me to help her son. What if I accept? What if I become Daniel's informal consultant, helping him recover from the trauma? That gives me legitimate access to the house, the family, the situation. That's dangerous, Monroe said immediately. Ashford is facing life in prison. He's got nothing to lose. If he thinks you're there to gather more evidence, then he'll make a mistake. Marcus's voice was hard. He's arrogant, Monroe. Always has been. He thinks he's smarter than everyone else. That's why he kept such detailed records, because deep down, he wanted credit for his genius. If I can get close enough. If I can make him believe I'm just there for the boy, he might slip up. Monroe studied him for a long moment. You know, this could backfire. He could hurt you. He could go after Daniel or Victoria. There's a reason we don't typically use civilians in undercover operations. I'm not a civilian. I'm a victim of his crimes who happens to have expertise in exactly the field he was exploiting. Marcus stood, decision made. And those 17 kids deserve justice. Real justice. Not a plea bargain because we don't have enough evidence. Not a light sentence because his lawyers are better than ours. If you do this, Monroe said slowly, you'd need to wear a wire. Document everything, and you'd need to be extremely careful. One wrong move and I spent 8 years in prison surviving people who wanted me dead. Marcus interrupted. I think I can handle one narcissistic surgeon under house arrest. Monroe was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a different phone-a-secure line. I need to run this up the chain. If we're going to do this, it has to be official. You'd be working with us, not going rogue. While she made calls, Marcus walked to the window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, 17 families were trying to piece their lives back together. 17 children were learning to use voices that had been stolen from them. And one man sat in a mansion, probably already planning his defense, confident that his wealth and reputation would protect him. Marcus had spent years dreaming of revenge against Ashford. In prison, late at night, he'd imagined all the ways he could make the man pay for stealing his life, his career, his freedom. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about making sure no other child ended up like Daniel. No other doctor ended up like Marcus. No other family ended up shattered by one man's ambition. Monroe hung up and turned to him. They're in. But there are conditions. You follow protocol exactly. You don't take unnecessary risks. And if at any point we think you're in danger, we pull you out immediately. Agreed. And Marcus? Monroe's expression was serious. Ashford already destroyed you once. Don't let him do it again. Marcus nodded, but he was already thinking ahead. To the meeting with Victoria and Daniel. To the moment he'd walk back into Richard Ashford's world. Not as a victim, but as the architect of the man's complete destruction. 8 years ago, Ashford had framed him with lies and falsified evidence. Now Marcus would return the favor, except this time every piece of evidence would be real. Every accusation would be true, and every word would be recorded. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. Stay away from my family. This is your only warning. Marcus showed it to Monroe, who immediately began tracing it, but they both knew who had sent it. The game was beginning, and this time Marcus wasn't planning to lose. The Ashford mansion sat like a monument to ill-gotten success, 8,000 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Marcus stood at the front door, the wire taped to his chest, feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Victoria opened the door herself. No butler, no staff. She'd fired everyone after the arrest, unable to trust anyone who had worked for Richard. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, leading him through a foyer that could have fit his entire prison cell 3 times over. "Daniel's upstairs. He's been so excited since I told him you were visiting." "And your husband?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Victoria's jaw tightened. "In his study. 3rd floor. East wing. He stays there most of the time. The court order says we have to remain in the same house, but it doesn't say we have to see each other." Her eyes met his. "He knows you're here." "I told him you were coming to evaluate Daniel. How did he react?" He laughed. The pain in her voice was raw. "He said you must be desperate for relevance if you're reduced to playing therapist for a child." Then he said ... double quotes. She paused, swallowing hard. "He said you should be careful around Daniel. That convicted criminals shouldn't be allowed near vulnerable children." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Marcus touched the wire beneath his shirt, making sure it was still secure. Monroe and her team were parked 3 blocks away, listening to every word. Daniel was in a playroom that looked like a toy store had exploded. But the boy sat alone in the corner, away from all the expensive games and gadgets, drawing with crayons on plain paper. "Hey, Daniel," Marcus said softly, kneeling beside him. The boy looked up, and his face transformed.
"Hey, Mr.
Marcus." His voice was still rough, unpracticed, but growing stronger every day. "You came. I promised I would, didn't I?" Marcus looked at the drawing, a crude but recognizable sketch of a hospital room, a boy in a bed and a figure with a mop. "Is that from the day we met?" Daniel nodded vigorously. "You saved me. Mommy says you're a hero." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "I'm not a hero, buddy. I just did what anyone would do." "No." Daniel's voice was firm with the certainty only children possess. "Daddy said I couldn't talk. All the doctors said I couldn't talk. But you knew they were wrong. You knew the truth." Before Marcus could respond, a voice echoed from the doorway. How touching. Richard Ashford stood there, looking remarkably composed for a man facing multiple felony charges. He wore expensive loungewear, a glass of scotch in one hand, the ankle monitor visible beneath his designer sweatpants. Daniel's entire body went rigid. His newly freed voice died in his throat, muscle memory of 7 years of enforced silence taking over. "Hello, Marcus," Ashford said, his tone conversational, as if they were old colleagues meeting at a conference. "Have to say I'm impressed. Getting out of prison, maintaining your innocence all those years, and now here you are playing savior in my own home. You always were persistent." Victoria moved protectively in front of Daniel. "Richard, you're supposed to stay in your wing. It's still my house, Victoria. Or have you forgotten who pays for all of this?" Ashford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, I couldn't resist saying hello to our guest. After all, Marcus and I have so much history." Marcus stood slowly, positioning himself between Ashford and the boy. "You should go back to your study." "Should I?" Ashford took a sip of scotch, his movements deliberately casual. "Or maybe we should have a conversation. Clear the air. You know, doctor to doctor." "You're not a doctor anymore," Marcus said quietly. "And neither am I, thanks to you." Ashford's laugh was cold. "Still bitter about that?" "Come now, Marcus. You were getting too close to something you didn't understand. I had to protect my research. You would have done the same." The wire was recording everything, but Ashford was too smart to confess outright. He was dancing around the truth, goading Marcus, testing him. "Your research," Marcus repeated. "Is that what you call torturing children? Research?" "I call it innovation." Ashford's mask slipped slightly, revealing the zealot beneath. "Do you have any idea how much my work has advanced the field of neurological communication? The devices I developed could have helped millions by testing them on infants without consent." Marcus's voice was steel. "By implanting them in your own son." "My son was the perfect subject." Ashford's composure cracked further. "Controlled environment, consistent observation, no variables I couldn't account for. Daniel was supposed to be the proof of concept for the entire program. A child who grew up with enhanced neural pathways, whose brain adapted to the device, who would eventually... He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize he'd said too much. Victoria's face had gone white. Enhanced neural pathways? Richard, what are you talking about? You said the device suppressed his voice? You never said anything about... The suppression was temporary, Ashford interrupted, his eyes blazing now. Phase 1. Once his neural development reached the optimal stage, I was going to remove it and implement Phase 2, a device that would give him enhanced vocal capabilities. Perfect pitch, expanded range, the ability to modulate tone in ways normal humans can't. He would have been extraordinary. The room fell silent. Even Marcus, who thought he'd understood the depths of Ashford's depravity, was stunned. You were going to experiment on him again, Victoria whispered. Even after removing the first device, you were planning to. It wasn't experimentation, Ashford roared, his carefully maintained composure shattering completely. It was evolution. Daniel could have been the first of a new generation of enhanced humans. And you, he whirled on Marcus, you would have understood that if you hadn't been so narrow-minded. When I showed you the preliminary results 9 years ago, you called it unethical. You threatened to report me to the medical board. You left me no choice but to eliminate you as a threat. There it was. The confession Monroe needed. Marcus kept his voice level. So you framed me, falsified patient records, made it look like I'd conducted the illegal experiments. It was easier than I expected, Ashford said with chilling casual. You were always so focused on the work, you never paid attention to the politics. A few altered files, some manufactured witnesses, testimony from patients I'd paid off. The medical board was eager to believe that the brilliant young surgeon had gone rogue. Nobody wanted to think that someone of my stature could be involved in anything improper. Victoria stumbled backward, groping for a chair. 8 years. You let an innocent man rot in prison for 8 years. He would have ruined everything. Ashford's face was flushed now, the scotch and his anger combining into something ugly. The grants, the research, the foundation, it all would have collapsed if Marcus had exposed what I was doing. I built an empire, Victoria. I changed the field of neurology. And I did it by making hard choices that weak people like him couldn't stomach. Daniel whimpered, pressing against his mother. The sound seemed to penetrate Ashford's rage, and he turned to his son with an expression that might have been affection in a normal person but looked more like possession. You'll understand someday, Daniel, he said, his voice softening in a way that was somehow more disturbing than his anger. When you're older, when you see what you could have become, you'll understand that I did this for you. Everything I did was to make you special. I was already special, Daniel whispered, finding his voice despite his fear. I didn't need you to hurt me to be special. The simple truth of it hung in the air. 7-year-old child articulating what his father's narcissism would never allow him to comprehend. Ashford's face twisted. You don't understand. None of you understand. I'm a visionary. History will. The front door burst open. Agent Monroe and 6 FBI agents flooded in, weapons drawn. Dr. Richard Ashford, Monroe announced, you're under arrest for violation of house arrest terms. Witness tampering and additional charges of conspiracy to commit medical fraud. Ashford's expression cycled through shock, rage, and finally settled on cold calculation. I never left the house. Check my ankle monitor. We're not arresting you for leaving, Monroe said, pulling out her phone and playing a recording. We're arresting you for this. Ashford's voice filled the room, crystal clear. I had to protect my research. You would have done the same. I built an empire by making hard choices, ... Quotes' face went pale as he realized what had happened. His eyes snapped to Marcus, seeing the slight bulge beneath his shirt where the wire was hidden. You. The word was barely human. You set me up. No, Marcus said quietly. I gave you rope. You hanged yourself. Ashford lunged, but 3 agents had him on the ground in seconds. As they cuffed him, he was screaming about his rights, his lawyers, his reputation, but underneath the legal threats was something more primal. The sound of a narcissist watching his carefully constructed world collapse. We also executed a search warrant on your study, Monroe continued, her voice cutting through Ashford's screams. We found 17 devices in various stages of completion, files on 63 additional children you'd identified as potential subjects, and perhaps most damning video recordings of every procedure you performed on your son, carefully labeled and archived like they were educational materials. Victoria made a sound like she'd been punched. Daniel buried his face in her shoulder, crying. You documented everything, Marcus said, almost wonderingly. After all these years, after everything you did to cover your tracks, you kept trophies. You couldn't help yourself. Ashford stopped struggling. His eyes met Marcus's, and for the first time there was no calculation in them. Just pure, impotent rage. I would have changed the world, he hissed. I would have been remembered as a pioneer. And you ... you're nothing. A failed doctor playing janitor. You destroyed me out of jealousy. No, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of 8 years of wrongful imprisonment. 8 years of planning, 8 years of waiting for this moment. I destroyed you because you hurt children, because you stole my life to cover up your crimes, because someone had to stop you. As the agents hauled Ashford toward the door, he twisted around for one last look at his son. Daniel, tell them Daddy was trying to help you. Tell them you understand. But Daniel just held his mother tighter and turned his face away. The silence of that rejection was more devastating than any words could have been. After Ashford was gone, the mansion felt different, lighter somehow, as if a malevolent presence had been exorcised. Victoria sat on the floor with Daniel, both of them crying, but this time there was relief mixed with the pain. Monroe approached Marcus. That was good work. The confession, combined with the evidence we found, gives us everything we need. He'll never see the outside of a prison cell. Marcus nodded, feeling exhausted down to his bones. The other children, the ones he was planning to target? We're contacting all the families now. They'll be warned, protected. Because of you, 63 children will grow up with their voices intact. Monroe paused. You know, the medical board has already reached out. They want to fast-track your license reinstatement. After this, after everything you've done, ... double quotes, I don't know if I want it back, Marcus admitted. 8 years is a long time. I'm not sure I'm the same doctor I was. Maybe not, Monroe agreed. Maybe you're better. Victoria approached, still holding Daniel's hand. The boy looked up at Marcus with eyes that held both trauma and hope, the look of someone who'd survived something terrible and was learning to believe in safety again. What happens now? Victoria asked. Marcus thought about the question. About 8 years in a cell. About a career destroyed and slowly rebuilt. About 17 children finding their voices and 63 who would never lose theirs. Now, he said slowly, we make sure every single child affected by this gets the help they need. Medical evaluations, therapy, whatever it takes. And we make sure Richard Ashford's research is destroyed so completely that no one can ever use it to hurt anyone again. And you? Victoria's voice was soft. What will you do? Marcus looked at Daniel, then at the drawings scattered across the floor. A child's attempt to process trauma through art. He thought about the other 16 children out there, struggling to adapt to voices they'd been told they would never have. I think, he said finally, I'll do what I should have done 9 years ago. Help the people who need it most. Not for fame or grants or recognition, just because it's right. Daniel tugged on his mother's hand, then whispered something in her ear. Victoria smiled through her tears and nodded. Mr. Marcus, Daniel said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Will you come back to visit? Mommy says we might need help for a long time. And I trust you. Those 3 words, I trust you, carried more weight than any medical degree or professional accolade ever could. Yeah, buddy, Marcus said, kneeling down to Daniel's level. I'll come back as many times as you need. As he left the mansion that day, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years. Not satisfaction or victory or even justice, though all those were present. He felt purpose. Richard Ashford had tried to destroy him, and in many ways had succeeded. But in the process, he'd inadvertently created the one person who could stop him, the one person who understood the technology, the crimes, and the cost of silence well enough to break through it all. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge. Sometimes it's simply about making sure the guilty can't hurt anyone else ever again. And sometimes the best way to rebuild your life is to help others reclaim theirs. 18 months later, Marcus stood in front of a modest building in downtown Seattle, looking up at the sign that read, Phoenix Voice Center, Neurological Recovery and Support. It wasn't fancy, marble floors or crystal chandeliers like the Ashford Mansion, just a renovated warehouse with bright paint, comfortable furniture, and equipment specifically designed to help children recover from neurological trauma. The name had been Daniel's idea. Because we all got our voices back, the boy had explained, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. Inside, the waiting room was full. 12 of the 17 children affected by Ashford's experiments were there with their families for the center's official opening. The other 5 had recovered enough to return to normal life, though Marcus stayed in touch with all of them. Dr. Chen? A young woman approached one of the physical therapists he'd hired. The reporters are here. Are you ready for the press conference? Marcus adjusted his tie, still not quite comfortable with the attention. The past year and a half had been a whirlwind. His medical license had been reinstated with a formal apology from the state medical board. The wrongful imprisonment lawsuit had settled for an amount that made the lawyers salivate, though Marcus had put most of it into founding the center. The trial had been mercifully swift. Ashford's own meticulous documentation had been his downfall. Faced with overwhelming evidence, even his expensive legal team couldn't manufacture a defense. He'd been sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, essentially a life sentence for a man in his 60s. Victoria had divorced him immediately, donated his entire research foundation to victims' advocacy groups, and started therapy. She and Daniel still had a long road ahead, but they were healing. She'd even started dating again, a kind art teacher Daniel adored. Give me 5 minutes, Marcus told the therapist. He needed a moment before facing the cameras and questions. He walked through the center, past treatment rooms designed specifically for children recovering from voice suppression, past the art therapy studio where kids could express trauma they didn't yet have words for, past the family counseling offices where parents learned to help their children heal. In one of the playrooms, Daniel sat with 3 other children, all of them laughing at something on a tablet. His voice was indistinguishable now from any other 8-year-old's. You'd never know he'd spent 7 years in silence unless someone told you. Daniel looked up and waved. Dr. Marcus? Come see this. Marcus smiled and waved back but didn't interrupt. This was what healing looked like. Kids being kids, unsupervised and unburdened, at least for a moment. Agent Monroe found him in the hallway. Hiding from your own press conference? Preparing for it, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. Sure there is. She handed him a folder. Thought you'd want to see this. Ashford's final appeal was denied yesterday. He exhausted every legal option. He's done. Marcus took the folder but didn't open it. He'd stopped reading about Ashford months ago. The man had taken enough of his life already. How are you doing? Monroe asked, studying his face. Really? It was a question people asked him constantly now. Journalists wanted to know how he'd survived 8 years of wrongful imprisonment. Medical colleagues wanted to know how he'd rebuilt his career. Victims' families wanted to know how he'd found the strength to fight. The truth was more complicated than any of them wanted to hear. Some days I'm fine, Marcus said honestly. Some days I wake up thinking I'm still in that cell. Some days I'm angry at all the years I lost. But then I come here, I see these kids laughing and talking and healing, and I remember why it mattered. Why all of it mattered. Monroe nodded. For what it's worth, you did something remarkable. Not just exposing Ashford, but building this place. Turning your pain into something that helps others. That takes real strength, or stubbornness, Marcus said with a slight smile. My cellmate in Riverside used to say I was too stubborn to give up. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was. Monroe glanced at her watch. The press is getting restless. Is he ready? Marcus took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the conference room where 24 reporters waited. The questions came rapid fire. How did it feel to be vindicated? Would he sue Ashford personally? Did he hate the medical establishment? How did he cope with the trauma? Marcus answered each one carefully, staying focused on the message he wanted to send. That justice, when it finally comes, isn't about revenge. It's about prevention, about making sure no one else suffers the same injustice. Dr. Chen called out a reporter from the back. Richard Ashford gave an interview from prison last week. He said you ruined his life out of jealousy, that you were never as talented as him and couldn't stand seeing his success. What's your response? The room went quiet. Everyone knew about Ashford's continued attempts to paint himself as the victim, but hearing it directly was still jarring. Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Richard Ashford didn't lose his life because of me. He lost it because he chose to torture children, including his own son, in pursuit of fame and funding. He lost it because he framed an innocent man rather than face accountability. He lost it because, when given every opportunity to show remorse, he continued to justify his actions as genius rather than acknowledge them as crimes. He paused, looking directly at the camera. As for jealousy, I spent 8 years in a prison cell for crimes I didn't commit. I lost my career, my freedom, and years of my life I'll never get back. If he thinks I did all of this because I envied him, then he still doesn't understand the fundamental difference between us. I became a doctor to help people. He became a doctor to use people. No amount of success or talent justifies what he did. The reporters scribbled furiously. This would be the headline quote, Marcus knew. But it was the truth, and he was done hiding from the truth. After the press conference, families lined up to thank him. Parents whose children could speak again. Siblings who finally got to hear their brother or sister's voice. Grandparents who'd thought they'd never hear certain words. One mother, tears streaming down her face, grabbed Marcus's hands. My daughter just said I love you for the first time yesterday. She's 5 years old. 5, and I finally got to hear her say it. Thank you. Thank you for giving us that. Marcus had no words adequate for moments like these. He simply squeezed her hands back and nodded. As the crowd thinned, Victoria approached with Daniel. The boy had grown several inches in the past year and a half. His face losing some of its baby roundness, his voice gaining confidence. Dr. Marcus, Daniel said formally, then grinned. I mean Dr. Chen. Mom says I have to use your proper title now that we're at your official center. You can call me Marcus, he said, ruffling the boy's hair. Always. We brought you something. Daniel handed over a wrapped package for your office, so you remember why you do this. Marcus unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a framed drawing, the same one Daniel had been working on that first day in the hospital, but refined, detailed, clearly the work of many hours. Quote, it showed a hospital room, a boy in a bed, and a man with a mop. But this version had something new, words flowing from the boy's mouth like musical notes, spreading across the page in brilliant colors. At the bottom, in careful child's handwriting, thank you for giving me my voice back. Love, Daniel. Marcus felt his throat tighten. This is perfect, buddy. Thank you. There's something else, Victoria said quietly. She handed him an envelope. From all 17 families. We wanted you to have it. Inside was a letter signed by every parent whose child had been affected by Ashford's experiments. It thanked Marcus for his courage, his persistence, and his compassion. But the last paragraph hit hardest. You lost 8 years of your life to save our children. We can never repay that debt. But we promise to honor your sacrifice by living the lives and raising the children that Richard Ashford's cruelty tried to steal from us. You gave us back our voices. Now we'll use them to make sure this never happens again. As the opening celebration wound down and families began leaving, Marcus stood alone in his new office, hanging Daniel's drawing on the wall. Through the window, he could see the city stretching out before him, millions of people, each with their own struggles, their own pain, their own need for healing. 8 years ago, he'd been a promising surgeon on the verge of exposing a terrible crime. Richard Ashford had destroyed him to prevent that exposure. Falsified records, fabricated witnesses, a meticulously planned frame job that had stolen Marcus's freedom, his career, his life. But Ashford had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that destroying Marcus's reputation and locking him away would be enough. He'd never considered that Marcus might survive, might emerge stronger, might use everything he'd learned both in his medical training and in his years of wrongful imprisonment to become the one person capable of bringing Ashford down completely. The best revenge isn't about making your enemy suffer. It's about taking everything they tried to destroy and rebuilding it into something they could never corrupt. It's about using your pain to prevent others from experiencing the same injustice. Richard Ashford had tried to create enhanced humans through torture and experimentation. In the end, the only thing he'd created was his own downfall. Marcus Chen had lost 8 years of his life, but he'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, even when the system fails, even when powerful people conspire to destroy you, truth has a way of emerging. Justice has a way of prevailing. Not always quickly, not always easily, but eventually. His phone buzzed with a message from Monroe. By the way, 3 more doctors have come forward with evidence of similar research programs in other cities. Your case opened the floodgates. The FBI is investigating now. What you started isn't finished. It's just beginning. Marcus read the message twice, feeling the weight of it settle over him. More children saved, more criminals exposed. More voices freed. He thought about Ashford sitting in a prison cell right now, the same kind of cell Marcus had occupied for 8 years. There was poetic justice in that. But Marcus had learned that real justice wasn't about revenge or karma or even punishment. Real justice was about making sure that when you're finally free, you use that freedom to free others. If you've been following this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true stories about justice, resilience, and the power of never giving up even when the whole world tells you you're defeated. Marcus turned off the lights in his office, Daniel's drawing illuminated by the city lights streaming through the window. Tomorrow, the Phoenix Voice Center would see its first patients. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, standing in the center he'd built from the ashes of his destroyed life, Marcus allowed himself a moment of peace. He'd been broken. He'd been framed. He'd been imprisoned for crimes he didn't commit, but he'd survived. He'd fought back. And in the end, he'd transformed his pain into purpose. Richard Ashford had tried to silence Marcus Chen. Instead, he'd created the one person who would give voice to all of Ashford's victims. Sometimes the greatest power isn't in never falling. It's in rising back up and using your scars to help others heal. And that, Marcus thought as he locked the door behind him, was the real victory.